Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this roundtable workshop in the name of freedom, right-wing populism and the end of the liberal world order. So my name is Victoria Brown. I'm a reader in political theory at Oxford Brookes University, and our three panelists in this session are Tina Manahan from Oxford Brookes, Todd McGowan from the University of Vermont, and Barry Axford, also from Oxford Brookes. So each panelist will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then at the end we'll join together for discussion. So I'd like to ask Tina Manahan to start us off, please. Off you go, Tina.
Great, thanks, Victoria. Okay. So in a nutshell, I'm going to put forward two questions. How does populism work, and or what elements do you think are overlooked? And what are the implications for liberal democracy? So in a nutshell, I'll just kind of go out and say, I think gender is overlooked, or at least a particular psychoanalytic reading of it. And my contention really is that what we witnessed in the siege of the Capitol in Washington and in the occupation of downtown Ottawa by the Freedom Convoy can be understood as the reenactment of a white masculinity that both founds and transcends the law. In other words, what I think gets lost in many analysis is the most literal reading of the events possible. That what we are seeing in these and surrounding events is a particular contingent of white men fighting off a concerted challenge to white patriarchal power. Borrowing the words of Gabrielle Dietz and Julia Roth, the success of right-wing populism is usually attributed and reduced to economic, nationalistic, or cultural reasons and motivations. I'm going to take this further and say that even when gender is acknowledged, it ends up being read as secondary and or as a displacement to the primary motivating factors, such that the idea remains that what's really driving events is economic dislocation and the accompanying nationalist and racist fantasies of a return to a lost golden age, one when men, of course, ruled their worlds. We can see this both in psychoanalytic accounts, wherein while on the one hand, it's argued that these and other populist fantasies, both presently and historically, cannot be understood in terms of the loss of an objective reality on the one hand, but presented as the product of genuine economic anxieties. So if you take Zizek, for example, you have the fantasy figure of the Jew in Nazi Germany that spoke to the capitalist crisis. In my own work previously, for example, I have argued that the fantasy figure of the Muslim spoke to anxieties produced by neoliberalism. And we can also see this in specifically gendered analyses of populism, where you might get this sort of brilliant gendered analysis, but it will be followed by a statement along the lines of the following. The real political and economic contradictions, however, are not addressed directly, since far-right populism as an ideology seeks not to situate social conflict where it originates, but to obscure or externalize it. So in the remaining time, I want to put forward the case for the primacy of a gendered analysis, one that reads the rise of far-right populism the rise of far-right populism, is linked to the inherent antagonism within Western liberal democracy, and even more specifically in terms of the aggrieved entitlement of white men. So here I'm going to invoke the concept by American sociologist Michael Kimmel to refer to, in terms of aggrieved entitlement, to a perception that the benefits and or status you believe yourself entitled to have been wrongly taken away from you by unforeseen forces. But I'm going to do this in ways that more specifically address the rhetoric and the symbolics of the Freedom Convoy and the siege of the Capitol, in terms, for example, of the trucks, the fuck Trudeau flags, the attempt to kidnap the Michigan governor, etc., and in ways that draw on a Lacanian psychoanalytic concept of jouissance. So I can't tease this all out here, both because of time and just because it's not fully worked out, but I will lay out some of my key points of my thinking. So, okay, one, I'm beginning with the assumption that jouissance is a political factor, which means, basically means that humans are not simply pleasure principled or interest maximizing animals. So as evidence in war, military bonding rituals, fascism, and Brexit, for example, we also seek the lures of enjoyment that can accompany nationalist, racial, religious, and class-based antagonism, And the idea is that these need to be counted as significant factors motivating human behavior and shaping politics. 2, attending to jouissance as a political factor can involve a reading of populism that takes us from a strictly liberal economic or Marxist reading of populism that foregrounds the so-called left behind of globalization, who are usually thought of in terms of white working class men, to a reading that engages more specifically with the transgressive elements we see in populist movement. And this, of course, is evident both in the siege of the Capitol, the Freedom Convoy, but anything. I mean, I was trying to think of good examples. Basically, just think Trump in terms of the ongoing kind of transgression of social and political norms. So this gets us point 3. This gets us to the problem of liberal democracy, or what Zizek calls the pathological stain of liberal democracy, which basically refers to the fact that underlying liberal democracy's promise to treat everyone equally without regards to race, sex, class, sexual orientation, etc., there is this ethnic remainder, or this leftover something conceived of as the nation. And this is revealed in our flags, our national pastimes, national foods, etc., etc. Which, for Zizek, he says, to which formal democracy clings. So in other words, a couple points about this, and the first one, I don't think this will surprise anyone. So contrary, anyone here anyway, contrary to the standard push and pull model of democracy that conceives of the social political sphere as composed of sort of distinct individuals and groups, all competing to make their voices heard. For Zizek, this is not a neutral competition. But furthermore, and more to the point from a psychoanalytic perspective, it's one that's loaded with libidinal investments, psychic drives, etc., that cannot be reduced to rational interests. So this is where you get stuff like fantasies of the other stealing our jobs, ruining our way of life, etc. You also get here stuff like the underside of law, so the non-legal but socially sanctioned lynch mobs, for example, as well as legal frameworks that are libidinally invested. So here we might, for example, consider the role of precautionary risk frameworks in the war on terror and the ways in which these play to enable the drive to identify and weed out the enemy other, to identify the Muslim enemy other within. Okay, so 4, basically from a psychoanalytic perspective, although Alenka and Todd might have other thoughts, but I think I'm on fairly safe grounds up until this point. My concern is that this is where the gender dimension, so yeah, I think I'm on fairly safe grounds, but this is where I think the gender dimension tends to drop out in both psychoanalytic and non-psychoanalytic accounts. And so at this point, we're still kind of left with the train of nationalist and now racist fantasies that are driven by economic anxiety. And I think this is odd on several counts, which I will just run through quickly and then move on to my last point, which is point 5. So empirically, as we know, it's been established that this is not just a white working class movement. I mean, just to take the Freedom Convoy, for instance, it was neither supported by truckers or workers in terms of the unions. B, while women play a significant role in these movements, this does not change what Gabriel Dietz and Julia Roth have described as a common feature in all current versions of right-wing populism, the obsession with gender. And we can think of this in terms of crusades against gender ideology, general homophobia, the desire to reclaim manhood, traditional family values, all of that. C, relatedly, if we want to attend to the rhetorical, symbolic rallying points of these movements, perceived as stolen, is not simply economic power, but perhaps even more to the point, white male entitlement to women, to resources, and to the land, is evident in what one commentator called the fetishization of petromasculinist artifacts in the Freedom Convoy, such as jerry cans, barbecue grills, and of course, the trucks. As Simon Strict explains, that the corollary to feelings of lost entitlement is the sense that white men are victims of a hostile totalitarian force, namely feminism and or wokeism, and that larger societal shifts have conspired to make men feel sexually awkward, unsuccessful, and unaccomplished. Okay, so this is basically the groundwork. So now, point 5, and to make sure I don't go over time, and just kind of sort of fast forward a bit and try to cut straight to the chase. I'm going to cut quote a small section from Todd McGowan's recent book, The Racist Fantasy, to ask, and hopefully I'll get to speak to Todd after about this quote in a slightly different direction, and definitely not so as to discount the racial dimension of his argument, but to make the gendered one more prominent. So here's the quote. The racist fantasy, like all fantasies, has three primary figures. There's the subject, the object desired, and the obstacle to that object. Even though the object appears as what the subject desires to obtain, the object is actually unimportant in the fantasy. The only significance that the object of the racist fantasy has is that it's unattainable. Unattainability is initially what kickstarts the subject's desire for it. But what characterizes the racist fantasy and differentiates it from other fantasies is that the obstacle to the object, what bars the subject's access to unrestrained enjoyment, is the racial other. And I guess I'm thinking, but in the case of the siege of the Capitol in Washington and the Freedom Convoy, we see it is also political correctness, wokeness, as well as environmental and health regulations that are perceived as the bar to accessing the subject's unrestrained enjoyment. And I will propose that all of these could be read in terms of the emasculating feminine. And this is something that's not unique to populism per se. And here I'm boring on Susan Jeffords and stuff, but we sort of see this all the time. We see this in terms of the lure of war, in war and crime films, when men are asked to overcome the emasculating constraints of rules, regulations, and laws to be men. And to be the men, we need to restore, if not the world, then at least justice and democracy. And we also see this in jokes, just in terms of emasculating women. And this, I'll share an awful one I recently heard from a wedding. The groom was asked to put his hand on the bride's. He did so, and then came the punchline: "Enjoy this moment. You'll never have the upper hand again." So again, there's this idea that women essentially emasculate men, and the domestic emasculates men. Law and order. So the point I want to make is that while none of this is unique to populism, I think it's important to an understanding of right-wing populism. And this will bring me to two conclusions. Conclusion one, in the transgressions that have come to define right-wing populism, we see men reclaiming the jouissance of the transgression, and through it, a staged fantasy return to the patriarchal order or brotherhood of right men. Phantasmically and materially, this fraternal contract has always resided alongside Western liberal democracy, according to an imaginary wherein for the rest of us, our rights and our voice is ultimately granted at white men's behest. From time to time during the civil rights movement, 60s, the so-called battle of, and again now, what we see has been described as the problems of a democracy gone too far. Borrowing the words of the philosopher Gregoire Chamaillou, what we are seeing in turn may be described as the return of, quote, the lynch mob reaffirming itself as the real and original power behind the legal power, the primordial and always reactivable source of constitutive power. Behind the formal power of institutions and the law, there is a group from which everything derives, that caste of right men, the substance of the state. So what was staged in the siege of the Capitol and the Freedom Convoy was a fantasy reenactment, one wherein, again, to quote Chamaillou, white men and they alone possess the phallus. So we get here this parody form of masculinity, freed from the constraints of law, promising to take back the nation. And my last and final conclusion, very quickly, just in case any of this isn't controversial enough to generate discussion, I'll wrap up with what I think follows from this. Contrary to some of the backlash against the Me Too movement and the suggestions that contemporary statute debates are merely symbolic and hence secondary or superfluous to the, it strikes me rather that the struggles evident in Me Too movement in its universal form and in the statute debates are precisely where it's really at. And while class is important, reducing populism to a class issue is a big mistake. And that's it. Thank you.
Sorry.
You muted.
You're muted, Victoria.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Tina. That was very much within time. So we'll move straight on to Todd now, please.
All right, thanks everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I'm just gonna try to think about, or I took the two questions to heart, and I'd like to think about, start with this idea of like why right-wing populism has such an appeal. And I think one of the things that's really central to it, or maybe the thing for me that's central to it, is that in contrast to other political movements that privilege the good, right-wing populism highlights enjoyment at the expense of the good. So right-wing populism targets figures that champion the good, and it targets them in the name of enjoyment. And I think this is what we see at work in the Ottawa Freedom Truckers movement, the anti-vax movement, the January 6th insurrection, just to name a few of the more conspicuous recent events. And I think what's interesting is, whereas capitalist society's experts argue on behalf of the good, right-wing populism disdains it. And I think this is, in a way, something that it has to teach us, even though obviously it doesn't follow this logic to the end point. So right-wing populism leaders always are supplying people with an agent responsible for their failure to enjoy as much as others do. And in part, I'm piggybacking on what Tina said, and I have some things I'd like to respond to that too. But they even do more than this. They enable followers to enjoy through the hatred of the figure who's responsible for their failure to enjoy. So following the populist leader, we can see behind the curtain and recognize who's really running the capitalist show, and thereby cheating us out of our enjoyment. So this paranoia relieves us of the burden of our own freedom and gives us someone to follow, populist leader, and provides a figure who's really in charge, who's the target of the paranoid suspicions. And this populist paranoia, I think, has to target the expert, because experts provide a fundamental obstacle to unhindered enjoyment. So the expert, you could say, is necessarily a killjoy. Populist leaders don't, and I think this is for me, the key to what defines a populist leader, that they don't rule on the basis of their expertise. So they're populist to the extent that they're not experts and express disdain for expertise. And I think it's this absence of expertise that enables people to view them as a site for identification, as one of us, rather than a member of the ruling elite. And it's what constitutes leaders as populists rather than as typical politicians. So as non-experts, populist leaders are in the situation of the people themselves, rather than those financially, intellectually superior to them. As non-experts, they don't belong to the oppressive apparatus that's taken the people's enjoyment from them, even though they could inhabit the seat of power in capitalist society. So I think one of the strangest facets of Donald Trump's reign was his insistence on opposing his own government. And Bolsonaro did this as well. While in office, Trump inveighed against the government as if he was an outsider. And I think this tack's really revelatory, that no matter what ruling position the populist leader obtains, the leader can't psychically enter into the ruling apparatus. So, because I think to do so would be to associate oneself with expertise and to abandon the populist mantle that's the source of the appeal in the first place. So it's easy to understand, I think, why paranoia targets immigrants, other figures of the outsider, as the barrier to the subject's enjoyment. The outsider who doesn't belong obviously threatens all belonging, exposes the non-belonging of the subject itself, and so on. But the paranoia surrounding the figure of the expert, I think, is a little bit more difficult to unpack, because experts belong to the social order. They're trying to help people out. They're trying to keep it running efficiently. Why would they? They're not outsiders in any sense. So when one thinks about it, it seems as if we should be applauding their work rather than being suspicious of them for depriving us of our enjoyment. But the populist leader, and I think this is what's nicely instructive, makes clear exactly what the problem with the expert is. When it comes to the theoretically most revelatory populist leader, I think Trump surpasses any other, inclusive of Hitler, precisely because he targets expertise even more than any previous populist leader did. So Trump's concern for the illicit enjoyment of immigrants is pretty easy to understand. As I said, traditional fare for the populist paranoiac. But the attack on university professors and other experts is more revelatory. So Trump's decision to attack expertise, I want to claim, was absolutely central, the central thing to his popularity and to his significance as a haven for populist sentiment. So the opposition between Donald Trump and his pandemic advisor, Anthony Fauci, I think nicely highlights this contrast between the populist leader and the expert. Even though Fauci actually worked for the Trump administration, the two constantly critiqued the proposals of each other, often bluntly. Trump obviously was the instigator of this mutual critique. At one point in the struggle to control the COVID-19 pandemic, Trump told a group of reporters, this is about one of my favorite Trump lines of all, he said, "People are tired of hearing about Fauci and all these idiots." Fauci's idiocy, according to Trump's thinking, stemmed precisely from his distance from the people, his attempt to dampen the people's enjoyment. And for his part, Fauci undertook a pretty vigorous campaign on behalf of mask wearing and other kinds of precautionary measures during the pandemic. He claimed that social distancing and masks would promote public health, which Fauci took as unequivocal good. Trump, however, thought social distancing and masks were, and I think he was right about this, a barrier to enjoyment of parties, going out to restaurants, seeing friends. So Trump set himself up as an opponent of the expert and the good in the name of the excess that capitalism itself promises. So by taking this position, he evinced his populism. So Trump's disdain for experts derived from his disdain for any limitation on enjoyment. And I think that's what populism is really promising, enjoyment without limitation. And the limits that the expert insists on become, in Trump's version of things, unnecessary constraints on our capacity to enjoy. A lifestyle that they demand would be better, would actually leave us bereft of enjoyment. And this is the enjoyment that makes life worth living. So Trump demanded that the people enjoy in the face of the experts' warnings, and his call for enjoyment came at the expense of both the individual's good and the societal good. I think experts are champions of the good, no matter what their particular expertise. To be an expert is to promulgate the good. So they tell us, for instance, how to organize society in order to have the good life, what to eat to have a good body, what to learn to develop a good mind, how to allocate our resources to have a good planet. The point of expertise is helping people to survive and even flourish. I think this word, the way flourish is so, everyone uses it all the time. I think it's a sign of the rule of the expert. So as champions of the good, experts of whatever stripe always extol the good at the expense of enjoyment. And ironically, I think this even applies to enjoyment experts. There's this figure, some of you may not know of them, some of you may have one, of the life coach. And the life coach tells us how to arrange our existence so that we can maximize our enjoyment and thereby turn our enjoyment into a good that can be managed and controlled. So the good demands restraint, whether wearing a mask, having a car seat, wearing a seatbelt, so that we don't use it up. Enjoyment, in contrast, operates precisely through being used up. So enjoyment's the excess that we experience beyond what's useful for our prosperous survival. So we enjoy through the sacrifice of the useful for the sake of the excessive. To insist on the good in an epoch organized around enjoyment, that is the epoch of capitalism, is to run afoul of the basic structure of the social order. So there's a real contradiction. The experts advocating the good, capital society is structured around enjoyment. Even though capital society produces experts galore, these experts, I think, necessarily work against the fundamental imperative of the society. But their role is precise. They provide the good that capitalist subjects can sacrifice for the sake of their own enjoyment. So the experts tell us the food we shouldn't eat so that we can enjoy eating it, the exercise we should do so that we can enjoy not doing it, and the products that we shouldn't buy so that we can enjoy buying them. So as capitalist subjects, we hire basically experts to tell us what we aren't going to do. And the fact that their advice is often so contradictory If you've ever tried to diet, you would know that this is absolutely true. It makes it even easier to disobey because you disobey even when you think you're obeying. So the good is subject to a calculus. We can always figure what specific decisions and practices are necessary to arrive at it. And utilitarian philosophers turn the calculus about the good into their field of expertise. Peter Singer would be the great example of this. They calculate the distribution of pleasure and suffering to come up with the proper decision in every social situation. Every expert, though, even those most opposed to utilitarianism, proffer some calculation about the good. So one advocates a carbon tax to save the environment and punishes those who consume the most. Another calls for veganism to protect the goods of all species. Experts calculate to arrive at the optimal good. So the good continues to exist in capitalism to serve as a barrier to our enjoyment. We need this barrier, I think, because direct access to enjoyment suffocates it. So enjoyment survives only through its inaccessibility, and this inaccessibility forms through the good. So the good serves as a protection against enjoyment, just as the expert stops us from destroying the world by offering good advice. But the good's primary function is to serve as the vehicle for enjoyment. So the good doesn't lead directly to enjoyment. Instead, it gives us something to sacrifice so that we can enjoy. We erect the good, in other words, as an obstacle that we can subsequently sacrifice to enjoy. And I think this is the role that the expert plays in capital society. Right-wing populism is rightly suspicious of the logic of the good that the expert promulgates. The lesson that we can draw from it is that enjoyment is the starting point for our political being. So I think right-wing populism is right, so to speak, to take on the expert, but I think it goes awry when it promises a pure excess without any sacrifice. That's the dream that's at the heart of all these populist movements, and it doesn't see the way in which it actually depends upon the thing that it's sacrificing. Because the pure excess doesn't exist, we can only find the excess through the sacrifice, and making that connection, I think, is what differentiates an emancipatory project from this right-wing populist one. Okay.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I'm looking forward to the discussion. But first, we have Barry.
Thank you, Victoria. My response to the two questions posed for this workshop is framed by the interplay between populism, globalization, and the interlocking crisis of modernity. I suppose I want to evoke features of contemporary politics that tend to the systemic rather than focus on motivational complexity, including various socio and psychopathologies of anti-politics, which is the way in which populism is often discussed. I'll divide my remarks into three parts, two if I look like running out of time. The first will locate the current spate of populisms in the dialectic of local and global, and as a movement in the changing character of globalization. The second is an injunction not to reduce populism to the default cadence of left versus right, but to construe it as a variable feature of post-hegemonic and indeed postmodern politics, I suppose. And third, if I have time, we'll canvass the risks posed by populism to some facets, at any rate, of the liberal world order. So populism and globalization, first of all. Sorry, I'm just checking that I'm on the same page. My screen seems to be doing curious things. Populism and globalization. Populism is a global phenomenon. John said this at the outset, it's true, but its temper and successes are massively inflected by local circumstances and traditions, which for some makes it a global phenomenon. It's also pertinent that the current phase of globalization is generally construed as a time of great rupture, insecurity, and uncertainty. And in this febrile climate, populism possesses enormous world-making, but also world-sundering potential. The recent wave of national populism is intricately connected to shifting perceptions of and prescriptions for globalization. National populism is now everywhere, though variably so. But its very ubiquity is witness to its appeal and arguably points to its growing potency. But here's the thing, maybe not. At all events, it reveals a paradox in global structuration, which is this. Notwithstanding populist denunciation of globalization as a process of border annihilating connection and globalism as an ideology of implacable convergence, populism is a multidimensional force that cuts across national borders and cultural lines of demarcation. In other words, it is a manifestation of the universalization of difference, I suppose. And that, rather than presumed homogeneity, is what characterizes the present phase of globalization. The populist explosion in recent years is rooted in the global politics of anger and revolt that intensified in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis. In this context, it musters, I think it musters at any rate, as an off-the-shelf vehicle of dissent, though bruited by some adherents as a new kind of politics, one that promises a radical solution for the ills of a cultural economy of relativism and a history of bad faith by political, cultural, and economic elites. Crucially, it is no less potent for being described as thin in the pantheon of political ideologies. Indeed, I go so far as to say thinness may make it more at one with the plastic conditions of politics, especially of political identification that obtain today. Understanding populism not only as a backlash against globalization, but also as a globalizing force in its own right, affords some purchase, I think, on an axial feature of the globalized world, the imbrication or antithesis of local and global, of difference and sameness. But it gives it a piquant, at least a piquant twist. A resilient anti-globalist strain of populism has emerged over the past few decades, responding to the turbulence caused by the successes and failures of market globalization. And its political and cultural avatars. Its ascent confirmed the destabilization of once taken for granted shibboleths, including the central importance and durability of unfettered markets and the philosophical and cultural claims of, admittedly different strands, of cosmopolitan elitism. Now, all this conjures a messy politics of dissent and revolt. But today's great unsettling, as Steger and James have it, brings traditional right-wing populism into a curious partnership with the alt-right, with anarcho-capitalists, religious fundamentalists, conspiracy theorists, and anti-vaxxers, to name but a few. Responses to the modal turbulence have clustered around a more robust national centrism, exacerbated, of course, by COVID-19 and arguably embedded by responses to the pandemic. The key thing is that populism is not just a response to these crises, but the actual narrator for millions of people. The success of populism reflects the indeterminate and confusing nature of the times, sometimes championing free markets, at others trumpeting the virtues of closed or tightly regulated borders and refurbished sovereignties. While seeing all this, we don't have to depict it as a simple atavistic response to out there global forces or a form of selective autarky, even when trafficked in political platforms that offer a nativist and exclusionary slant on migration, job protection, and the preservation of various kinds of cultural identity. Indeed, there are other interpretations of populism. For example, on the left of the political and academic spectrum, 21st century populism is bruited by some, at any rate, as a reflex to the trammels of neoliberal globalization, rather than, or as well as, a despicable form of anti-politics. Let me move to my second consideration, populism and the crisis of political modernity. In many cases, populism manifests as an anti-global and largely defensive nationalism, spiced with crude nativism and xenophobia. Disporting as Laclau's empty signifier, this politics may indeed prove just a hiatus before normal service resumes. But it can be glossed more capaciously as a transformative moment in the playing out of 21st century modernity and globality. And in that respect, it is a visceral reminder, at the very least a visceral reminder, of the power of place, the particular, and the imagined exceptional in global constitution and identity formation. So although Steger and James, to just take one set of commentators, are right to talk about anti-globalism as a major contributor to populism's growing ideological heft, that seems to me, at any rate, to be less important than its attraction as an off-the-shelf vehicle for an ideologically unencumbered politics. The question is why? In this regard, I want to argue that its very lightness of being, which is so very postmodern, I believe, is a more important datum than its ideological weight, even though anti-globalism is paradoxically a world-defining rallying call, supplying populists with the ideological cement to shore up their eclectic policy mix. Postmodern populism is appealing because it congeals the low opinion of usual politics held by many people and harnesses the outrage felt by a motley assemblage of those feeling materially left behind by globalization and culturally bereft because of it. For critics, this is not enough to redeem its sullied reputation, even leaving aside the awkward datum that it has been known to cohabit with and sometimes to be defined by doctrines of white supremacy, religious fundamentalism, authoritarianism, and outrageous strains of conspiracy theory. In temper, postmodern politics chimes with and exemplifies today's post-truth politics, inscribing the uncomfortable knowledge that politics and identities are increasingly vociferous, and any form of authenticity or even authoritative utterance hard to conceive of, let alone come by. So postmodern populism, which implies relativization and even transcendence, very difficult word to say, and even transcendence of modernity's principles and forms, holds up a mirror to current politics and the current phase of globalization. And what that shows is both unedifying and, just maybe, in certain circumstances, with lots of qualifiers, a tad palatable. But the fragmented quality of protest politics tempers any impulse to generalize. This is a world manifesting different kinds of revolt, and that variety is itself a reflection of growing, not to say systemic, multipolarity. The descendedness or multi-centeredness of this world qualifies unequivocal descriptions of a predominant or hegemonic variety of globalization or global system. Capitalism is differentiated, and neoliberalism increasingly fails to convince as an overarching and steadfast rubric, because big, among other things at any rate, because big players in emerging markets, China, India, and Northeast Asia have developed and continue to develop outside it. Modi's populism in India is a mix of autocracy, ethno-religious nationalism, and neoliberal economic dogma. While by the end of his sole term, possibly as president, Donald Trump beggared any model of ideological or policy consistency, touting a blend of Jacksonian conservatism and protectionism alongside neoliberal formulaics, and an increasingly white version of American nationalism. He was even labeled by some as America's first postmodern president. Populism musters as a robust challenge to the remnants of embedded liberalism and to the currency of its neoliberal spawn. As Danny Roderick says, so conceived it is part of an ideological and policy rebalancing of globalization. Of course, in the event, postmodern populism too may be no more than a cathartic response to periodic crises, a shock to the system, rather than its successor in waiting. And that syncs, I think, with its hit and run style of politics. Populism appears to demand transformation, albeit of a back to the future variety, but it is perennially light on detail. In the fullness of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now in its partial aftermath, such cultishness may continue to find favor with disaffected electorates, but in the longer term, maybe not. And to a great extent, that depends on how deep and how widespread the politics of anger and of cultural security run. How serious is the demand for change in the battle to rebuild the world economic and domestic economies, rebuild world and domestic economies after successive crises? We know the depth of anger and the degree of polarization that is extant, or so we now think, though many commentators dismiss such things as either passing whimsy or, more likely, a dangerous basis on which to build a new politics, to fashion radical economic policies and to mend broken cultures. Populism's credentials in these respects are wide open to question. How committed are various electorates to radical solutions, and what would a politics born of such radical commitment actually look like? The cultural turn, so-called, of late, has encouraged people to repose once billable political issues into matters of identity that are not so malleable, and these are legion. So in the broader warp of social change, what signifies is a politics founded on insecurity as the dominant motif for turbulent times. Crucially, insecurities are manifest over the stability of borders and identities, around different tastes and imaginations, as well as over jobs and wages. And of course, COVID-19 added a new source of universal insecurity. Populism did not cause these insecurities, but taken in the round, it narrates a crisis of modernity that is unlikely to be resolved through mere refurbishment of usual politics. Because of that, in the global scale of things, it still has a course to run. But can it be redeemed as a project that tempers globalist excess, holds at bay the indifferent globalities of microbial infection, and heals cultural divisions? The answer is probably not, and certainly not entirely. But what I have argued here locates postmodern populism as a feature of a globalized world itself in the midst of change. and as a quickener in the ontological shift away from political and quotidian, also very difficult to say, modernity. In sum, then, the crisis of modernity is many faceted and appears both as a faltering in the philosophical project defined by the concept of rationality, progress, and the unified self, and in the universalist pretensions of Western moral philosophy and civil law. It also manifests its challenge to the main principles of modernization, those of liberal perfectibility, human emancipation, and globalization. On this accounting, the crisis is thoroughly systemic in its threat to the Western cultural account and as a global script or meta-narrative of social progress. I could stop at that point with just a few words of conclusion, but if I have time, I have one more section to go. What do you think? I'll take advice from...
So presuming we started at 2, we're finishing at 3, everyone had 15 minutes and we have 15 minutes for discussion. There is a couple of minutes left for you if you would like to do...
I'll just conclude. Thank you, Victoria. So to conclude, while being the self-proclaimed nemesis of neoliberal globalization, populism is a symptom of what is or may be globalization's new illiberal and sovereigntist phase. This mix and the politics it spawns plays differently across the world, but always coheres around perceived loss of identity, status, dignity, voice, respect, and of course, how could one forget, economic well-being. While playing to different cultural scripts in particular localities and producing more or less disagreeable politics to boot, these are modal issues and point us towards long-term, large-scale global change. So Laclau's empty signifier aphorism, which saw populism as a kind of pro-tem arrangement while real politics dusts itself down, also admits a more challenging and likely more worrying interpretation of populism and its effects. In this interpretation, it is not a variant of usual politics or a periodic feature of systems that are disturbed while still tending to equilibrium, but a global moment in the disruption and transformation of modern politics, of modern life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There were 3 very interesting provocations. I do have lots of questions, but I'm going to follow the logic of the good and open it to the floor to start with. So I'm just going to put it on gallery view. So if you have a question, can you use the digital hand function, please? Okay, I think Gary's digital hand went up first, so we'll start with Gary, please.
Hi, thanks a lot. I enjoyed all the papers and I'm kind of reflecting on them. But I would like to kind of pose a question to Todd. In that I thought your paper was delivered incredibly clearly, and you pointed up kind of issues or contentions within capitalism and liberal democracy, I think. But you pointed to those tensions so kind of strongly, I think, that it seems to me that we don't have to explain populism, right wing and left wing, but it's why there isn't more populism that is the question. And you tended to point up a tension between a utility maximizing capital and the pronouncements of burgeoning experts who kind of have a kind of hold on the good, and the tension between the good and utility maximizing is the problem which populism expresses. Now that does strike me as a problem, but also, and I think more than you allow for, there is an inherent gap between expertise and the good. You can never get to the good simply from expertise, and that presumption is a problem. And so both that is a real problem, which populism does respond to, plus also the inherent problems of representation. You know, are you ever going to represent opinion? And so it strikes me that your explanation is on the right grounds, but it goes pretty deep into the contemporary kind of polity. And it's even more because there is no direct line from experts to the good. So the populists are onto something in challenging it, not simply in terms of utility. I wonder if you want to respond to that.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting that you pointed out the exact thing that I cut out of what I was going to talk about. So, I mean, my whole point was, sorry, not my whole point. A little point was going to be that the thing about the good is that you can never arrive at it, right? So that the expert is always going to put us on the path to the good, but we're always going to come up short of the good. And that you might even say that the way in which we come up short of the good is the form that our enjoyment takes. And so I think it's absolutely right. That's why that's the thing, that in a certain sense, the populace is onto something, that the expert says, if we just arrange things in a certain way, everything will work. But it's never gonna. And I think, to me, and I mentioned this, the diet thing is really crucial. The way in which if you look at, I don't know, whatever website, 1 week later, you'll get the exact opposite advice on, okay, now you have to not eat any carb. No, now you have to not eat fat. Like the way in which the expert advice can never get you to the point of the good, and you're still dead of cancer, right? So I think it's really a crucial point. The only thing I would say about what you just said, I don't think that capitalist society is organized around utility. I think it's organized around enjoyment. And I think I think that all of the experts' advice is meant to be sacrificed. It's meant to be not followed. It's meant to be. So I think that's a really other crucial part of it.
Yeah, I was thinking about Benthamite utility maximizing in terms of pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. So we've got Ruth's question next, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the three papers or discussion points, statements. Basically, I think there are a lot of other emotions in play, and I don't come from the kind of Lacan psychoanalysis. I'm a discourse analyst, and I work in a very interdisciplinary way. I think that fear and anger, and here I go together with Barry, are very much fundamental for far-right populist movements. And coming from Austria, which wasn't mentioned in the big list of populist countries or populist leaders and so forth, basically far-right populism started basically straight after the war, Second World War, 1949. And the big figure in Austria was Jörg Haider in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think when looking at the rhetoric of these basically really very charismatic figures, we see that the play with fear and the savior were fundamental for their success. So playing with fear and anxiety and talking to the anger, the so-called Wutbürger in German, is constitutive for their success, because they can tell the people that they will save them from the crisis, from whatever danger, whatever threat is out there. And by being this big savior, making America great again, but making Austria great again was already said in the 1980s, or make Germany great again. These are really constitutive slogans and constitutive for the ideologies. I agree with the thin ideology. I will talk about this later in the second panel, but I thought that fear, anger, and anxiety were left out of the picture. So I would like to hear what you think about that. And the second question I have for Tina is about the gender issue. I think that gender has been thought about a lot in the far-right populist literatures, especially looking at Marine Le Pen, but now also Giorgia Meloni and other figures. And the question was always, how come that women can be leaders of such masculine parties? Well, they obviously can, because they adapt other roles. They are either the mothers or the sisters or the daughters, but they're not strong sort of feminists. But on the other hand, there are feminists as well in the far-right populist movements, for example, in the AfD in Germany, where, for example, you're allowed to be queer or lesbian or gay, but only if you belong to the folk, only if you're part of us. So that is reserved again for the homogeneous people and not for the others. So we have interesting distinctions and definitions. And the question which was always very important was, how come that when Trump was so misogynist and sexist, why did women vote for him? Which they did, obviously. Many white women voted for him. Talking to Kasmude, he said there was an interesting survey which showed that racism was more important than sexism. So people were more, and women were more frightened of migrants and Mexicans and Muslims, etc., than they were angry about the sexist remarks and misogynist behavior. I don't know if this is right, but I think it's an interesting question.
Could I come in on that before whoever else responds? I mean, I agree with Ruth about the importance of talking about the politics of anger in understanding the current spate of populisms. The interesting question for me, however, is whether, and maybe for populist leaders as well, is whether or not a politics of anger can be sustained. You know, we're not in conditions now, or at least we have not been in conditions now that bear resemblance to conditions in and around the Second World War, for example. To predicate your platform of appeal to an increasingly disaffected electorate on the basis of people being permanently angry leaves wide open the possibility of ridicule, failure to deliver. What is interesting also, however, is that the attacks on experts of various sorts may be in that sense an instrumental device by populist leaderships to actually expand the rubric of what constitutes despicable elites. So clinicians, bankers, teachers can all be mobilized in this respect at no great cost, and presumably without a great deal of empirical evidence to sustain the claim. And if this is successful, it at least provides a continuation of, or a diversion of, a management device with which to control the otherwise uncontrollable politics of anger, which populist leaders must fear as much as other leaderships. Just an observation.
Okay, thanks. Tina and Todd, would you like to comment too?
Sure, I'll come in. I'll just, thanks for your comments, Ruth. I guess I'll just say a couple of things. I mean, in terms of anger, I think, well, yes, you know, people get angry when their, you know, entitlement or whatever is barred. So I'm not denying that anger is a factor by any means, but I guess I think, you know, how anger can be channeled in so many ways. It can be channeled through, you know, unions. It can be channeled through, you know, there's various things we can do with anger. But I think what we're seeing in these movements is, and, you know, particularly the sort of transgressive element of jouissance, of you know, the kind of parody we're seeing of masculinity, of, you know, Viking hats and all of this kind of stuff that's coming out and a bit over the top. And so that's, I guess, in terms of the anger question, the part I'm interested in is the then what's, you know, actually kind of happening, you know, in the movements around these rallying points and this kind of release of this, you know, kind of ridiculous, almost absurd form of enjoyment, which is also transgressive in that it's specifically going against the norm. And you talk about this in terms of your book, the normalization of, what do you call it, shame, or, you know, and all of that. I guess, and I think you're right. I mean, in terms of gender, yes, and this is kind of what I'm interested in is that there is really brilliant gendered analysis out there, and it's including you, and that's also citing stuff by Julia, who I don't know if she's here with us yet, but will be, and Simon. But in not all cases, but you still often get this case that the real primary issue is still sort of economic. And that's, I guess, what I want to kind of play with a little. And so I think I want to play with the idea that something's going on specifically with white masculinity, and that's what's actually being threatened. You know, I don't know how you measure these things, but sometimes I think, you know, maybe in a way at no other time are we seeing sort of the threat to the patriarchal order in Western liberal democracy. And again, how do you measure these things? I mean, it's always been kind of at risk with, like I mentioned, the civil rights and feminist protests of the 60s, the 70s, the so-called battle of the sexes in the 80s. You know, we kind of keep coming around, and I'm not sure I would want to say that there's a way of measuring it, but yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. But I guess if that responds to some of your questions.
It's not only anger, it's also the fear. And that was one point I was asking about, is they play with anger. And I think you're right. Anger can be mobilized, but can be channeled quite well in different ways. But fear and being the savior, that is a trope which cuts across all these far-right populist movements.
I just realized we're short on time, so I'll let Todd answer. But yeah, thank you, Ruth.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you said, Tina, and I just want to actually use my moment to ask you a question. So, and I think what was said in response to Ruth's question was, I agree with. So, I'm curious about the signifier white, because I've been shocked by the lack of I don't know what to call it, global solidarity with the feminist revolution ongoing in Iran. And so it seems like what's happening in Iran is exactly like what's happening in, I mean, I understand we might not want to call Iran a liberal democracy, and so maybe that changes something, but I don't necessarily think so. I think like the dynamic is the same. And so I just am curious why you use the signifier white. And the other thing I would say is, maybe people don't know this, but between 2016 and 2020, the only group that Trump lost voters in was white guys. So I hate white guys as much as the next person. So I'm not on their side, but I do think it's not, I think it's a little, you know, I think you're really onto something about the gender thing, but I think Iran is kind of paradigmatic. And I think the lack of global, like, why isn't there this global, you know, there's a few things like Marianne Cotillard burned or cut her hair or something, but there's not really that much happening. And so I think, I don't know, I'm not sure, I mean, obviously I also don't want to minimize the racist dimension of someone like Trump, but I do think that it's not just, I think you're onto something even, you know, beyond white. And so that's why I'm just curious about that signifier.
Sorry, I'm just gonna
sorry,
interject.
I usurped.
No.
So
I am no, that's
that.
absolutely. Please don't worry about that. I'm just aware we've got 5 minutes. So what I thought we could do is take the questions from Simon and Alenka together, and we can put a pin in that discussion about whiteness, because I'm sure it will recur in later panels if we do run out of time to discuss it in this one. So could we just kind of briefly take the questions from Simon and Alenka?
All right, thank you so much. I'll keep it brief. Thank you so much for your talks. I have like one tiny thing and maybe a larger question. What was kind of like reacting to what Todd said and to talk about anti-expert kind of stances. I think it's necessary to understand that the right wing also produces alternative experts, and especially in Germany, I've been following like an academic right wing who kind of like, these are the cancel culture people. In the US, you have the same discourse, which are academic elites who kind of like participate in right-wing populist discourses in the same way, but as elites. So it's not an exclusive anti-elitism. That's just a footnote. The other thing is I wondered, we had in 2 talks at least strong psychoanalytic like approaches, and I wonder because I always approach like populism and the right wing as a political economy, and what is happening when we kind of like supplant analyzing a political economy or an affective economy, for example, with a psychoanalytic one. And what kind of like short circuits does that bring into our analysis? Because I'm really like cautious, like this is the universal drive for jouissance that is working there. Because to me, it seems we lose some avenues of inquiry or of critique there when we do that. So I was struck by that. So I wanted to address that. Maybe we could keep it on through the other panels. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Alenka, if you could just come in there too. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, also very quickly, because my question actually somehow perhaps even reiterates the previous question from Simon. Actually, I was wondering with the way in Todd very rightly described this kind of dialectics of expertise and transgression, but the very politics of expertise is not something that just appeared now. I mean, this was the parrot horse of neoliberalism, eliminating politics from politics and replacing it with experts who will tell us exactly scientifically how to manage the society. So this was a kind of experts were kind of, I mean, I don't think it is just this kind of populist resentment of all science and so on that is at play here, but also the way that the experts or rhetorics of expertise, what role it played in the very neoliberal devastation that we are now living through. So it was all about get rid of politics, remove it from economy precisely, forget political economy. We need just experts who know exactly how to. And I think here what populism found is a kind of very, because populism is not the opposite of this, it is, as Todd very rightly said, it's just the worst side of the same coin. They are the same. I mean, experts and the bureaucratic enjoyment and this kind of transgression of their own rules, they go in pair. But what is lacking is precisely politics, which would be something else then, and it could be include politics of enjoyment, but this kind of capitalist formula of enjoying and forbidding and distributing it in a certain way, it's obviously not the only one thing. So just, sorry, I'm too long already.
Yes, so we've got 1 minute left. So I don't know if any of our 3 panelists wanted to respond to any of those points that have been brought up.
Sure, I'll respond. I think that's pretty great. I mean, I absolutely agree with both of those points, and I do think that the only thing I would say is that the postulation of the alternate expert is always an they need the other expert that they're the figure of the good that they're opposing, right? Like they depend on that figure, right? Like they can't, it's not like they're setting up their own expertise in a vacuum. And I think that's, I mean, it's really, I know a lot of people in alternative health and they're kind of crazy alternative health. And it's really important for them to be opposed to the medical establishment. But I think I take Alenka's point that like this is it's all, both are part of a massive retreat from politics, and I think that's true, and I think that's a, you know, that the response back has to be a politics that is asserting actual politics in response. So yeah, I think that's a really good.
Okay, great. So we're at just 1 minute past. So we've got a 15-minute break now before the next session. So I'd just like to thank all the panelists for brilliant provocations. We've got so much to think about, so much to continue talking about. So enjoy a 15-minute break and we'll see you back here at 3:15. Thank you.
We use the same link simply to re-enter the room.
I think so. If you can find your original link from your original invitation, then everybody will
Not
come up
this one. Otherwise, we will all appear again as Tina.
as me. Yeah, yeah. So if you can find your original.
The original. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Shall we leave it a minute, John?
Yes, might just leave it a minute. There's 17 people here now. I'll just sort of spotlight everybody
Okay.
who's taking
Cool.
part. And so it's Simon, I think. Simon and Rico is yeah.
Simon, Ruth, and Rico.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Apologies if there's background noise, by the way. Someone's having a meltdown in my house.
Oh dear. I can't hear anything actually at all.
Well, that's good. We'll just leave it one more minute, see if we get anybody else.
Yeah, yes. Hopefully a few more will come along. Oh, there's another Tina coming in. And another one.
Right, there's a rush of Tinas. Shall we get started now?
I think yes, we might as well, absolutely.
Otherwise we'll run out of time. Right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the second session of In the Name of Freedom, Right-Wing Populism and the End of the Liberal World Order. So my name's Dan Bully, I'm Reader in International Relations at Oxford Brookes. And we're going to have 4 interventions in this afternoon's session. So just very briefly to say, we'll have John Wheatley from Oxford Brookes, we'll have Simon Strick, and I'm not going to try and pronounce his institutional affiliation, best if he does that. I don't want to cause a diplomatic incident. We've got Ruth Wodak from University of Lancaster and University of Vienna, and we've got Rico Isaacs from the University of Lincoln. So take it away, John, whenever you're ready.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to highlight a few of the salient features of right-wing, or let's say nationalist populism that exist. And then I'm going to sort of look a little bit at the implications for democracy, liberal democracy specifically, which we haven't quite covered so far. And I'm not really going to be answering any questions. I'm more going to be posing them and just to set a number of puzzles that I think we need a little bit more thought to try to understand. So let me sort of begin with the whole the sort of nitty-gritty of what it is. And I'm going to quote a speech made by Nigel Farage on the early morning of the 24th of June 2016, which was the morning after the referendum, when it was just clear that the Leave campaign had won the Brexit referendum. And Nigel Farage said this: "This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people. We have fought against the multinationals. We've fought against the big merchant banks. We've fought against big politics. We've fought against lies, corruption, and deceit. And today, honesty, decency, and belief in nation, I think now is going to win." Now, just think of that speech and what it's trying to do. Effectively, together with the sort of populist paradigm, corresponding to the populist paradigm, it is effectively dividing people into friend and foe. So just as the definition by Casmuda. It's dividing society into the real people, the decent people, ordinary people, this idea of the pure people against these these elites. And note, of course, that the characterization of real people is not all the people. It's a particular group of people, specifically those that belonged to this project. Therefore, this divide that you get is very much inherent in this idea of us and them, this we the people against the enemy, however that is defined. So the enemy is always understood as some kind of elite, and normally is seen as a threat to the sovereign nation by, for example, being in cahoots with the EU, with Zionists, George Soros, whoever. Now, one classic feature is that populism associates itself with identity politics. So very much, and this is some of the work that I've been doing, that we in the 20th century, politics was very much about the struggle between the left and the right in many places. Now, of course, we had populism in countries, especially in Latin America and things like that, but the version, the brand of populism we have now was marginal. What we see today is the rise of this culture-based division. Another feature that's probably worth highlighting is that with this vilification of some sort of elite, this is very fertile ground for the conspiracy theorist logic. So let's just focus on a couple of conspiracy theories that are very much associated with populism at the moment. QAnon, the conspiracy theory of based sort of around Donald Trump and prevalent in the United States, is not a marginal theory. It's something that quite a large number of people actually adhere to. The idea, effectively, that there is a cabal of satanistic sexual abusers of children led by Hillary Clinton and others, that are operating a global sex trafficking ring or a child sex trafficking ring, and conspired against Donald Trump during his term in office. And this cabal goes on to include Hollywood actors, high-ranking government officials, business tycoons, medical experts. Another such conspiracy is what's known as the Great Reset conspiracy, and that was that the COVID-19 pandemic was planned by a global elite who introduced lockdown restrictions not to curb the spread of the virus, but to deliberately bring about economic collapse and a world government that would impose a socialist and ultra-green agenda and enforced vaccinations. This was mainstreamed by Thierry Baudet, who was the leader of the Dutch right-wing populist party, the Forum for Democracy, which actually won 5% of the vote and 8 out of 150 seats in the 2021 elections, although its supporters dwindled in the last year or so. And Baudet hails Putin as a leader of a front against globalists. So he says, I am a conspiracy theorist. He said, I believe that we are being governed by a global conspiracy of evil reptiles. My view is that the only global player who is opposing that is Vladimir Putin. So I'm a fan of Vladimir Putin. He is the Dark Knight. He is the hero that we need. So we can see the way this division, this bifurcation of society into the people who are good and the elites are bad, leads down a certain rabbit hole, and that's the rabbit hole conspiracy theory. So this is just something, a few of the features. I'll move on a little bit to the some more explanations of why this could be happening and some of the puzzles. So what does this all mean for liberal democracy? Now, let's start off by playing the devil's advocate. Some scholars would see populism as an emancipatory force. For example, Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, basically see that the problem is liberal democracy, and particularly the way it is associated with neoliberal free market globalization and the way neoliberalism has, or neoliberal hegemony, has become the notion that this is the way the world economy runs, and this is the way things work, has become shared by both the center right and the center left in a kind of a cozy consensus, and that populism is in some way an antidote to this, as it reintroduces the conflict and passion into politics, which is in itself the very nature of what politics is. In doing this, it brings up issues that are not talked about by ordinary establishment politicians. Now, if we look at the impact of this wave of populism in countries in which it is associated, in the US in 2020, they had the highest voter turnout since 1900, 66.3% of voters. And in the UK, around the time of Brexit, turnout in elections was higher by quite a significant margin than in the beginning of the century, 68.8% in 2017 compared to 59.4% in 2001. So there is this sense that an injection of populism, this wave, if you like, of nationalist populism has to a certain extent mobilized voters on both sides. But, and here I've been playing devil's advocate, even Chantal Mouffe, who is extremely critical of this, what she calls neoliberal hegemony, draws a distinction between what she calls agonism, which means a relationship between adversaries in a political space, where discourse is one of respect, and there is mutual acceptance by all sides that others are legitimate, even though there is profound and deep disagreement and even conflict, and antagonism, which means a relationship between enemies, which can, of course, be extremely disruptive to democracy. Now, the issue is that populism seems to generate not agonism in Mouffe's sense, but antagonism. So opponents are enemies of the people that actually have to be destroyed. In other words, kicked out of the electoral game and denied access to the media. So Trump's supporters who stormed the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021 believed that any action was permissible, even if it violated the democratic rules of the game, in order to make sure that the enemy did not take power. So this is the huge stumbling block in terms of democracy. Now let me round up with a couple of puzzles. So one puzzle that I have is why has why do we see this wave of globalization? Of nationalist populism. Now, one factor has already been mentioned, which is that of globalization, that both Tina and Barry touched upon earlier. So some scholars, for example, Hans-Peter Creasy, tend to explain the supporters of the populist radical right as losers of globalization, people who feel they cannot cope in a newly globalized world, and understand the populist radical right as a kind of a nationalist backlash against globalization. Now, if we look at the people who tend to support populist radical right parties in Europe, we see that to a certain extent, this does correspond, so that there are generally people who perhaps are less well educated, perhaps are older, tend to support these parties, but not everywhere. So Spain, supporters of Vox are almost indistinguishable between supporters of the ordinary centre-right party, the Partido Popular. Also Brazil, it tends to be the more well-heeled middle classes, amongst others, including the born-again Christian groups that supported Bolsonaro. So that's one explanation, but it seems to only provide a partial explanation. Another puzzle that I think we need to think about is why today is there a rise in identity politics? Why are there culture wars? Generally, people have become more mobile, more cosmopolitan, more tolerant in many ways in comparison with, let us say, the 1970s. So why have the parties that represent these cultural values been on the rise? One possible explanation is a conscious or unconscious strategy to draw voters' attention away from rising economic inequalities. So again, of course, this is a puzzle. We are more unequal societies in the 2020s than we have been for a very long time. So why is our politics about identity rather than about who gets the share of the cake? Is it that powerful interests, of course, you don't want to put too much, not necessarily conscious, but unconscious. Does power dictate that economic inequalities are not talked about? Again, another explanation is the perceived loss of status by traditionally dominant groups that Tina touched upon, the straight white male. One other factor, though, I think we really need to look at much, much more. And this is the digital media and how it works potentially to turbocharge radical populist right-wing thinking. Digital media forges like-minded communities that demonize some other. And these communities create their own realities, and they're based on identity or psychological affiliation. They're like, almost to a certain extent, like a religious cult. They're facilitated by the nature of digital media, a short statement which cannot by its very nature be nuanced, and by the algorithms of digital media. So there is a room to look at how does digital media work, how are these communities created, and how are certain orientations, let's say xenophobia, anti-vax, anti-feminist, anti-woke, transphobic, climate change skeptic, how are these threads interlinked through digital media? This is one, I think, area for discussion. A final area, which I think could be highlighted, is
John,
why
you're
for
out
some...
of time now, by the way.
Are we out of time?
So if you could just wrap it up there, that'd be great.
Yeah. Just a very quick puzzle would be why have some countries not had this movement? And here I would think of Ireland. Why in the Republic of Ireland is there no radical populist right party? Is it because Sinn Féin, as a populist radical left party, has effectively drawn their voters, or potentially is it because of the electoral system, which potentially deprives second preference votes and third preference votes to fringe parties and effectively weighs negative votes as single transferable, or gives basically takes account of negative sentiments as single transferable vote appears to do. Anyway, I've run out of time. Just a few thoughts, and I will hand it on to the next speaker.
All right, thanks. That's straight on to Simon Strickland.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, very good. So thank you very much for the invitation. My affiliation is the SEM Brandenburg, which is the Center of Media Studies in Potsdam. Thank you for being courteous there. Okay, I have this written down partially because I want to be on time. So one of the things, maybe as a pre-note here, I have widely stopped about work. I've stopped talking about populism because I think it's generally a term that doesn't work for me anymore. I've worked on digital media and the far right, the new right, and things like that. And populism, kind of like, maybe you see why I think it doesn't work for me, at least. So how does right-wing populism work, or what elements do you think have been typically overlooked? I have three answers to that. The one first is racism. The second point is the culture war. And the third is affect or emotion. And I will run these 3 points down very shortly. So the first is racism. I think that much research on right-wing populism or new fascism neglects to talk about race and racism. In Germany, this is particularly egregious, where I'm from, because so much populist talk on migration and or multiculturalism taps into very broad and very old, long-standing residual racist and even supremacist attitudes in German populations, and it weaponizes these into dissident positions for the white German majority. That is why I would say that the Great Replacement theory in all its various variations is the very backbone of all right-wing agitation, because it re-articulates racial panics and racial supremacy in political languages of alienation, of the loss of opportunity, of the loss of culture, of space, and of relevance. The Great Replacement theory is as much populist speech in general, identity politics for white majorities in majority white countries. One might say similar things or connected things about anti-feminism, about anti-Semitism, homophobia, and more recently also on anti-trans agitation. In my opinion, right-wing populism is organized and weaponized resentment against minorities. And it threatens less democracy as a system, but rather it threatens very directly these minorities, which, for example, in Germany, have been living under siege for the longest time. In my opinion, much scholarship has concentrated on the parallels between historical fascism and current right-wing populism, precisely for the reason to evade the question of racism. The racism that is both residual and structural, and which, in my view, is the central and historically uninterrupted logistics that brings various populisms and various fascisms together. So point 2 is what I call a cultural war from below, which has been neglected. I've worked on the digital right from the perspective of media studies and cultural studies. While other disciplines, for example, sociology and political sciences, have repeatedly remarked on the right-wing methodology of cultural warfare, they generally have neglected to follow its intricacies and its unfolding in everyday, very ordinary discourse, what I call right-wing world building. I've been researching this mainly on social media, and I cannot stress enough how important ordinary discussions, how important memes and other like digitized talking points are to right-wing populism and the new right. What is generally attributed to populism, that is the central antagonism between the people and the elites, this central antagonism unfolds in a myriad of small scenarios online, adding, in my view, the very important dimension of a culture war that emerges from below and not from the top, from the political system, as it were. A culture war that is articulated by everyday users, by small accounts, by influencers, and a million different alternative media in which very regular people use participatory media to voice their opinion, and they do so in culture war terms. It is at this level of very ordinary interactions, of the memification of populism, as it were, where issues like racism, anti-feminism, and all the other points are brought together into a populist fold or a populist feeling, and therefore become available as very public and very quotidian gestures of dissidence and of empowerment for certain people. And that is without the necessity for voting, for example, for then expressing something online and then having the necessity to vote for the AfD, for example. But you can just do it like this in a quotidian, casual fashion, as it were. In my view, this very granular level of a right-wing populism from below has been much neglected in research because a lot of research is focused on parties and politicians and voting numbers, for example, which often, and these parties and politicians often have little more than a parasitic relationship to this form of ordinary cultural warfare as it unfolds online and offline. It is therefore, in a way, like Andrew Breitbart of Breitbart News said famously, politics is downstream from culture. And I personally think that the Paul Joseph Watsons in the UK, the Stephen Crowders in the US, or the 4chans, the trolls of the internet, are equally, if not more important to understand right-wing discourse, more important than the AfD, for example, what Trump said in any interview, or any other official figures and structures. It is also at this very granular level that one can much better grasp, I think, the important heterogeneity of the discursive dynamics of the far right. And also its deep entanglement with capitalist attention economies, something that Zeynep Gambetti has worked very well on and very importantly on. And also one might grasp, since we've been hearing about QAnon, the very participatory logic of populism, where your opinion as a person of the people is kind of like an engagement thing. It kind of like puts value on what the ordinary person screams on Twitter. That is the logic of, as well, social media and of populism. So the third point is affect or emotion. With this third point, I want to extend on the last observation on this granular culture war from below. Populism research has talked a lot about, and Ruth Wodak is here, about the emotionalization of politics and populist discourse. Key terms and overall descriptors in this research were often a politics of fear, anger, or hate, as we already heard. As among many other people, Sarah Ahmed has pointed out in her text Fascism as Love, when one analyzes populist discourse as a subset, for example, of white supremacist discourse, a much broader range of emotional and affective articulations comes into view. That is, feelings of white empowerment, of love for the nation, for the culture, or for the race. Also notions of masculine self-help and betterment. So kind of like these self-coaches that, these life coaches that Todd talked about, the alt-right and the right wing has these life coaches in a sense of being a better white man in a feminist world. One example of this is the broad anti-feminist and misogynist coalition that exists online, which articulates its ideologies as a strengthening of maybe traditional or maybe dissident masculinities, the empowerment of what they claim are white men disenfranchised by a global system of feminist rule. As an affect scholar, I think that the shortening of populism to a politics of hate, anger, or fear has proven a much too simplistic diagnosis for a broad range of emotional and affective discourses. The shortening has also contributed to an implicit construction of liberal and neoliberal discourses to reside in hope and love, as Hillary Clinton called it. And this kind of like is kind of throwing together of those who are not right-wing populists to be on the side of not of fear or of anger or of hate, but being parties of love is kind of like not very helpful at all in the current climate. Again, this is an argument, I think, to acknowledge the heterogeneity of the right wing and its dynamics and discourses, which can, in my opinion, be traced in what I call the populism from below, both in online and in offline worlds. So I come to the other question: what are the implications of for liberal democracy in terms of populism? In my previous points, I've argued mainly for the heterogeneity of right-wing populism, namely that it has many different use values and realizations in ordinary, in granular discourses and movements, both online and offline. One implication of this is that right-wing or neo-fascist opinions, doctrines, or ideologies are in the current discursive situation articulated not as attacks on liberal democracy, but are articulated in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom, as this workshop is called. And to a certain extent, they always have been. So populist, racist, anti-feminist position and so forth are construed as not only valid position in the so-called free exchange of ideas, but also as a necessary part of democratic deliberation. This is not to be taken lightly, I think, because much of the counter discourse that we make against populism relies on showing that right-wing populism is either anti-democratic or totalitarian. I think in a very real sense, it is not. And if it is, that argument that it's anti-democratic has almost never worked as intended, but it has rather served the right as a confirmation of either cancel culture, of the suppression of conservatism, or even as proof of the great replacement in the arena of ideas. For example, in the talk about cultural Marxism as it prevails in the US. What is more, I think right-wing talking points are wielded currently as being the true democratic opinion, and as that very thing that an imagined, quote, far-left fascism, as Trump called it in 2020, is trying to outlaw. The emotional economy of right-wing talk is that one is keeping democracy alive by saying it, by committing to racism, to sexism, to revisionism, and so forth. The emotional economy is that one is indeed only a true liberal or a true Democrat when one is being in conflict with that alleged far-left fascism that is political correctness, gender studies, the globalist consensus, or whatever they have. Just one example for this, during the anti-vax protests in Germany, we could see and hear many demonstrators that equated COVID policies with a threat to democracy, with an emerging dictatorship or state fascism. They called it the DDR 2.0. These people actually used analytics of totalitarianism and analytics of fascism to describe the situation of the lockdown and to denounce the general vaccination mandates, though these obviously never actually came into work. These people were, in their perception and also in their emotional states, as it were, actively fighting against an encroaching dictatorship, and they were using the analytic language of fascism research for their arguments. They were, as much of the right wing claims to be in general, true Democrats and true anti-fascists. When you see today online a quote by Rosa Luxemburg, by Hannah Arendt, or by Sophie Scholl, it is very likely that this quote is coming from a right-wing or at least right-leaning or right-feeling account. The other implication of what I've been said is not really an implication, but in my view, somewhat of a correction. In my view, right-wing agitation, which is racist and sexist agitation, is not really an attack on liberal democracy. It is first and foremost an attack on minorities within white patriarchal nation states, whose distribution of democratic access has always been uneven, to say the least. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Next we have Ruth Wodak.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, both John and Simon, for your very interesting statements. And I'm very happy that you, Simon, mentioned social media, because I'm also going to talk about traditional media, which is an issue which hasn't really been touched upon, but I think is crucial also for the success of the far-right agenda. I will first talk a bit about what I see as the thin ideology of most of the far-right parties, but in a very context-dependent way. I think it's very important to embed each of these movements in their historical setting and also in the local national setting, how they emerged. I've already mentioned Austria, which is again very different from the German experience, and in that way, I think it's important to have this historical dimension as well. I think you, John, mentioned the 20th century. For example, the mayor of Vienna before World War I Lueger was probably the first anti-Semitic populist around. And Hitler, as we know, Hitler drew on him very prominently in his demagogy, populist demagogy, actually. So I think these historical threats are basically quite of interest. The third point I want to make is about the interdependence of far-right populism or radical right populism and the media. I think one cannot really emphasize enough how important that interdependence is and how the strategies of provocation and scandalization have helped dominate the media agenda and basically also in that way dominate elections. And the fourth point I want to make is about normalization, mainstreaming. These are two issues, or backsliding. There are many concepts floating around right now. I think this is what we really have to be concerned about nowadays. It's not so much the rise of the far right in many countries, it's the normalization of far right agenda in mainstream parties and the move to the far right by, for example, the conservative parties. Not everywhere, but I think the United Kingdom is quite a good example for that. So to start a bit with the thin ideology, and just 4 points where I think, and I have elaborated this in my 2021 second edition of The Politics of Fear, where I also mention hope. So it's not just fear and threat. There are basically 4 dimensions, which I just want to briefly define. The one is nationalism, nativism. That was already talked about quite a lot, sort of the imaginary of a homogeneous folk. And the nativism, I think, is very important, basically connecting this with white supremacy and also the Great Replacement, which was already mentioned by Simon. The second point is anti-elitism, anti-intellectualism. I call this the arrogance of ignorance, sort of to actually support ignorance as something which is better than the various experts. But as we have already heard, there are, of course, also very conservative, also far-right experts. But one has to emphasize here that it's also against those below. It's not just against those above, it's also against those below, the homeless, the beggars. Orban has actually made laws or that beggars are not allowed in Hungarian cities, etc. So it's also, again, against marginal groups, minorities, as was just mentioned before, and it's against those outside. So it's against those up, below, and outside. I think one has to differentiate those, the othering. The third point is the authoritarianism, which wasn't mentioned yet. The law and order, which is very important, hierarchical party structures, this charismatic leader figure who's the savior, the Robin Hood, whatever you want to call this person, and the move to authoritarianism on a kind of scale. Yeah, and I think this is what we notice nowadays with the normalizing of this far-right agenda. And the fourth point is conservative values, the family values, the very conservative gender politics, which was mentioned by Tina, and revisionism, which wasn't mentioned yet, the rewriting of history. One is either a hero or a victim, but history is rewritten again as a narrative of this special folk, yeah, this homogeneous people. And I think that to come to my second point, which was about the media agenda, in election times, it's very, but also otherwise, and in every day, it's very important to dominate the news agenda. And provocation and scandalization are two strategies obviously apparent with Trump, but long ago already used by many other far-right populist leaders. And this can be created very easily by scandals. And scandals which evolve into conspiracies, where then the far right constitutes and creates itself as victims of a conspiracy. And then finally, if they might have to apologize, or actually they have stopped apologizing right now because you can say everything and it doesn't matter, the next scandal and provocation starts. And if you follow either Farage or Johnson or whoever, you will see Trump. It's basically one provocation and scandal after the other, and journalists kind of keep running after those scandals, and other agenda just don't find place anymore to be elaborated or to be investigated. Actually, Trump was his own journalist. He didn't even need the Fourth Estate because he just tweeted. So I think this is an issue which really has to be thought about more in depth, how endangered press is. And that is something which leads me to my third point, to the normalization. If we take Orban and Hungary as an example already of on the move, or already a neo-authoritarian state, although inside the European Union, what are the characteristics? There's no more press freedom. Basically, Orban has abolished every free radio, every independent press. There's, I think, just one website which is still alive, which is independent. The freedom of the legislation and justice has been abolished. And basically the electorate has been redefined in ways so that his majority is always newly affirmed. So these are just three examples. Then there is, for example, that the Central European University was kicked out, and the anti-Semitism, and. But there are many other features. But basically, we have an attack and a challenge of major constituents of pluralistic liberal democracies. And I may just read you one paragraph, if I have the time for this, of an Orban speech where this comes very clearly, where he says 2018, it's become a very famous speech or infamous speech. In my view, the age of liberal democracy is at an end. Liberal democracy is no longer able to protect people's dignity, provide freedom, guarantee physical security, or maintain Christian culture. Our response, the Hungarian people's response, has been to replace the shipwreck of liberal democracy by building 21st century Christian democracy. We are Christian Democrats and we want Christian democracy. So it's very clear that liberal democracy is being transformed, and that there is this danger is being evoked of great replacement, that the Hungarian people will die out and be replaced by migrants, by Muslims, by the left, by whoever. And in that way, and the Hungarian language is threatened and so forth. And in that way, he is appealing for this Christian new illiberal democracy. And actually, I'm always concerned about using the term illiberal because we are repeating Orban's discourse, and I don't think that makes sense. We might find another label for this. And I think neo-authoritarian is what we actually now see in Hungary, and basically a bit less in Poland. So what does normalization mean? normalization means that the far-right agenda are being colonized by mainstream conservative parties, which is why, for example, UKIP has basically disappeared, but doesn't matter because the Tories have taken over the agenda of UKIP. Brexit has been done, and migration has been basically limited. And there are almost no asylum seekers who are taken up in the UK. So basically, you don't need those parties anymore because their agenda have been taken up. The same is true in Austria. The Christian Social Party, the ÖVP, has basically colonized the agenda of the Austrian Freedom Party. And in this way, former Chancellor Kurz won the elections very highly and very successfully. And now, because Kurz had to resign because of corruption, now there is a kind of a conflict between the far right and, let's say, the populist conservative party, National Conservative Party, about those voters, yeah, who used to be far right, then went over to the mainstream and are now floating, yeah, and who will take them over. And the normalization also means that the unsayable has become sayable, that constitutive human rights have been challenged, and it doesn't seem to matter. So in that way, what we now observe is this, what I also call the shameless normalization, to come back to the emotions. I think that the shamelessness appeals to the resentment, and in that way also legitimizes the marginalization of minorities. And I would like to stop here.
Thank you, Ruth. Brilliant timing. Okay, on to Rico Isaacs.
Thanks, Dan. So I've got some sort of very sketchy formative thoughts here, and there's kind of two things I'd like to focus on. I'm not entirely sure if either are related. I'm also not entirely sure that they address either of the questions set, maybe implicitly. I've kind of termed these sort of two interventions, populism as the moment of arrival is one, and then sort of populism as exile two. Populism as arrival sort of focuses on thinking about the relationship between populism and representative democracy, and I'm going to focus mostly on the work of Nadia Urbanati. And then populism as exile, it's more of a relational analysis, thinking about the relationship between populism and ecological crisis. So, as I said, I'm not entirely sure how interlinked or the extent to which they address the questions, but here we are. So populism in terms of its relationship with representative democracy, this is sort of building on the argument of Nadia Urbanati, and so she claims, and to some extent actually it's following on from what Ruth was describing in relation to sort of the transformation of democracy in Orban's Hungary, because Urbanati talks about representative democracy being a sort of deformity of, populism being a deformity of representative democracy, almost a perversion of representative democracy. So in democracy, many people claim to speak for the people, but it's rarer, or becoming, I suppose, more common when someone claims to only speak for the people. So the populist leader emerges from the ballast of representative democracy, in which Urbanati notes, and citing Aristotle, majority rule as a principle of representative democracy gives way to a regime of the majority. The deforming of representative democracy, basically, in which the majority become the people themselves. And consequently, there's kind of an effort to conceal and marginalize opposition or the minority. So in this context, the relationship between the leader and the people is direct. It's a highly vertical one. And to some extent, we can look towards Weber's plebiscitary sort of leadership model. Not strictly, I would say, a sort of form of charisma or charismatic leadership, in that I think the leader is often not necessarily endowed with special kind of quasi-religious qualities, as we often sort of in a typical kind of charismatic Weberian authority. Rather, the charisma of the leader extends from the fact that they possess a symbiotic relationship with the people, and the leader is the embodiment of the people. So the leader is endowed with the legitimacy as being the true representative of the people. So therefore, the leader arriving in power is synonymous with the people arriving in power. So, for example, just to cite quickly Trump's on his inauguration, he spoke of the day not just merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to you, the people. And further, he says, what truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. And January the 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day that the people became the rulers of this nation again. And earlier, John quoted Farage, and I've got exactly the same quote, so I'm not going to read it again, but basically the same kind of thing that Farage was talking about on that night was simply, was to some extent this idea that real people have arrived to influence power through Brexit. Meloni is the same to some extent in her sort of maiden speech as PM to the Italian Parliament. She talks about the victory, even though actually her government received fewer than half of the votes of the electorate, but that the vote for her was a clear indication, she claimed, expressed by the Italian people, and I quote, wholly representative of the will of the people. So these feelings, what I would say is these feelings of arrival are strong. So when the leader is ejected from power, so are the people, and to be shut out causes resentment, and that's when we saw the storming of the Capitol, and similarly in Brazil with the storming of the Congress, the Supreme Court, the presidential palace by Bolsonaro supporters. The other was it this month? It was this month. It was a few weeks ago. So I think the other thing I want to say about this idea of populism as a moment of arrival is that actually arrival appears in another way, in another form. It's not just observed in the arrival of the people in power as a consequence of the leader arriving in power, but also in the arrival of the minority, which facilitates a nativist and exclusionary discourse. So obviously we have sort of migration minorities who arrive as an external shock, whereby people who have they've been on a journey fleeing war, poverty, threat of violence, but their arrival seeks a response in the nativist populist leaders' sort of discourse and the movement, which is about the protection of the regime and the protection of the majority is required. So borders become important, a boundary needs to be put up, and that minority needs to be controlled, it needs to be securitized, and it needs to be sealed. So what does this say, this idea of arrival say about liberal democracy? I think I'm trying to say to some extent, or making claims that populism as a phenomenon is one of journeys, it's one of entries, it's arrivals and exits. It means once the populist leader has arrived, they can actually be very difficult to move. So even if formally power is transitioned, whether it's to Biden or Lula, resistance remains. The forces which bring populists to power do not disappear once they're removed via constitutional and legal rational means. So if we are to understand populism as a deformity of representative of democracy, the problem is once that the leader and people arrive, the deformity of democracy, representative democracy, remains. So moving on to think about exile. So this is to see populism in a sort of relational terms, and specifically its relationship to ecological crisis. So Bruno Latour in his 2019 book Down to Earth wrote about how the emergence of political crisis in liberal democracy and ecological crisis appears not by chance, and that populism and ecological crisis are inherently linked. So the perception of dwindling resources or declining access to sort of important resources triggers nativist claims over access to those resources, that the nativist majority needs to secure, border, and protect resources from those arriving from elsewhere. So this relationship between populism and sort of ecological crisis or environmental issues has been termed by Filippo Menga and Ed Atkins as populist ecologies. And there is a burgeoning literature on this actually in the last few years, particularly if anyone's come across the Environmental Politics Journal. There's often papers that sort of feed into this relationship. What I just want to say here is that basically populist ecologies, or this appear in different forms, but one common thread possibly that exists between them all is this idea of exile. So just a few examples. We can go back to the traditional 19th century populist, the Narodniki in Russia, whose movement was about elevating the interests of those tied to the land, and more importantly, their program of the Narodniki was an attempt by an urban intellectual elite to return to the land that they'd become untethered from, by trying to reclimatize themselves to the culture and mores of peasant life. The People's Party in 19th century, the US, was developed out of the Farmers Alliance organization, which sought to protect farmers from the new industrial monopolies which appeared in the US in the 1870s and the 1890s, where they saw in particular the alienation of those working from the land. Those working the land were being alienated from the fruits of their labor as a consequence of the industrialization of agriculture. But in contemporary terms, those both kind of relate to some sense of exile or feelings of exile from nature. In contemporary terms, or contemporary iterations of the populist ecological relationship, is typically we see it in the correlation between right-wing populist leaders and movements and climate action skepticism. So whether that's Trump, Bolsonaro, the Freedom Party of Austria, the Swedish Democrats, Alternative for Germany, all tend to be sort of vehement deniers of human-induced climate change, and have tended to institute or support laws that contribute to environmental degradation. And many critics of right-wing populism tend to see these types of movements as a threat to the global response to climate change. But actually, as Atkins and Menger have written on as well, at this relationship, the socio-ecological relationship between populism and environmental crisis is actually a bit more complex, and often, on the one hand, yes, you might have sort of someone like Bolsonaro who's anti-science, deforestation sort of agenda, is quite clear in plain sight about what he thinks. But on the other hand, you have other populist leaders who are much more sort of insidious in terms of, they might adopt a green agenda or the discourse of a green agenda, partly for an electoral strategy, partly perhaps to get something in particular from the EU, as Orban has done, and also try to create their own type of green agenda, which particularly for Orban, who speaks of it needs to be a Christian democratic one as well. The other relationship between ecologism and populism I wanted to point to, another sort of variation of it, is that between right-wing sort of fascism and environmentalism. So you do see this eco-fascist movement that's kind of reappeared, but that actually has a long history, particularly to the sort of 19th century German Romantic movement. If you think about some of the mass shootings in terms of El Paso, Christchurch, they have a kind of eco-fascist agenda. So what I just want to say about this, to in particularly in terms of populism as exile, is that a lot of the grievances driving elements of contemporary populism are also embodied in some form of experience, real or imagined, of exile from nature. So in the era of climate politics, human-induced climate change represents an intrusion into the settled order of industrial capitalist society, making existing social relations and the power of capitalist interest groups uncomfortable and untenable. In such conditions, nature, as the other, intrudes on the subjectivity of the anthropocentric self, and the reaction from those who feel threatened by the return of nature is to some extent the want to expel it. So this is to some extent precisely how we can interpret the relationship between right-wing populism and ecologism and eco-fascism. Both are rooted in the return of nature from exile and the loss of everything that had contributed to a sense of self and place in the world. While for right-wing populism, the intrusion of the other leads to a response of the expulsion of nature through climate change skepticism or insidious green policies which only serve to mask continuing environmental degradation, eco-fascism, on the other hand, accepts the other through its symbiosis between a discrete demarcation of the deserving people and the land. So eco-fascism's acceptance of nature is an exclusionary one in which the land belongs to or is part of a cultural identity of discrete community, a clearly defined self. The eco-fascist response lacks perhaps the act of generosity, which requires understanding the world is not the sole possession of a single group. Okay, I'll finish there. I don't really have any sort of defining conclusions, but yeah, they're my kind of general interventions as thinking about populism as some kind of form of arrival and exile. Thanks.
Thanks, Rico. Right, okay. So this leaves us a good half an hour for questions. Thanks to everyone for their timings, got it all spot on. So if you could indicate through the reactions function, hand up or whatever you want, that you got a question, then that would be good. I'll scan through and see if I can see any. We got a few Tina Manahans, so if John has a spare minute, he could change a couple of them. Okay, we've got a question from Tina first, the real Tina, I think, and then one from Barry. We'll start with Tina.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, actually, I have many questions, but I'll just start with one comment for Rico while it's fresh in my head. I was just thinking in terms of the Canadian Freedom Convoy and the sort of anti-environmental politics of that in a sense. But I mean, there's kind of this mix of entitlement to the land and the, imagination of Canada is this, huge open space where, rugged men have always had access to the land, to the resources. And so just sort of thinking through that in terms of the, the actual where the money came from for the Freedom Convoy was founded by big interest in Alberta and links to oil and all of that kind of thing. So it's, yeah, kind of goes with some of the stuff you're talking about, but in a slightly different direction, perhaps. Anyway, I just thought it might, if you follow this, and I thought it was really interesting. Yeah, thank you, everybody. I thought those were really interesting talks. I can, send me a message or something. I can send you some stuff later about, anyway, yeah, I'm rambling at this point, but thinking a lot. So I'll sign out.
Thanks, Tina. Does anybody want to respond on that point?
I mean, I'll just respond quickly. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know so much about the Freedom Convoy, what's going on there. I mean, what I would say about this populist ecologies thing is, and I have written about this a little bit, that it's about multitudes, right? So it's not the case that there is some kind of. I mean, I think initially when this literature started to emerge a few years ago, there was sort of a very direct argument that, oh, okay, you've got right-wing populism and it's climate denial, okay? But actually, I think once you start to unpack that relationship between populism and ecological crisis or environmental issues, you'll find actually it's much more complex than that, and there are all kinds of strands going on there. So it doesn't surprise me that you can either see some elements where that makes sense in terms of what I was saying, and other bits where it doesn't in terms of this case. So I think that the relationship is one of multitudes.
Okay, thanks. Does Simon and Ruth want to respond on that, or did you have your hands up? Okay, Simon, you go for a response on that.
I just wanted to add to Rico's talk because I find that vexed relationship so interesting. And one of the things that I claimed in my book was that the Great Replacement theory at heart is a theory that is very old, that comes back from the American eugenics days. Madison Grant and these people, like the vanishing of the great race or the passing of the great race, and at heart that discourse is also a kind of like conservatist discourse. It wants to conserve white culture. It wants to conserve the white genome. It wants to conserve white people basically who are under threat. And I claimed in my book that this is the Great Replacement is kind of like it's in competition with the climate change discourse because it's the same universal threat in a certain sense, and it's the same totalizing theory of, and there are right-wingers who claim human biodiversity is under threat through migration. And like the white race is part of human biodiversity. And there's a kind of like ecological discourse in that as well, which is kind of like half about climate change at one time, and the other half is about climate denial. climate change denial. And I think that's such a weird relationship. And I think you are really doing important work there of trying to trace it all out, how it works. But I think it's a very, very crucial thing to think about. So thank you for that.
Got anything to add there, Rico?
No.
Yeah,
I was just enjoying listening to that. That was
yeah.
good.
Okay, good. I think Barry was next.
Thank you, Dan. I'd just like to return to this question of online media and populist support. It seems to me, this is not based upon any sort of scientific observation, but it seems to me that a lot of the discussion about this, in which populist voters and supporters seem to be particularly susceptible to the online persuasion of charismatic leaders, artificial intelligence, whatever. And that there's very little commentary upon how those sort of features of our digital cultural economy actually affect other non-populist voters and supporters and so forth. So do you see that difference? If there is a difference, is it a correct inference from the data? And if it is a correct inference from the data, why are populists more susceptible?
Anybody want to go for that one? Go, John.
Yes, just one point there. This is an interesting point. I don't think necessarily populist voters are more susceptible. Maybe some of them are. I think it depends on whether you're getting into the hardcore sort of rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, which is more like an online community that more resembles a kind of quasi-religious organization or cult. But I think everybody's vulnerable to a certain extent. I mean, if you cast your mind back to the beginning of this year, when there was this spat between Andrew Tate and Greta Thunberg. Of course, he then showed off his cars and said, could you comment? And she came up with this tweet, yes, do enlighten me, email at this particular email address, which questioned the size of his male parts. But then there was a rumor around that by the fact that he went back to her and did a photograph of his pizza boxes that were he claimed were not recycled, and he had no intention of recycling them. And a theory came about that it was actually through the pizza boxes that he was identified and arrested for sexually trafficking young girls.
In Romania.
Now, there was no evidence for this at all, but I know a lot of people who had an anti-populist worldview who retweeted it and believed it because it fits their worldview. So I think everybody is susceptible to messages that they would like to believe over social media. And it's not only confined to populist voters, if you like. It's sort of everybody in a way.
But there seems to be a more holistic take on the part of the susceptibility of populist voters than others. I mean, the case you just mentioned is interesting, but it's a little local whimsy. You can see it taking off and going viral quite easily without making attributions about its systematic nature. There seems to be a sense that populist voters are more systematically susceptible to those kind of persuasions than other sorts of voters. Now, I may be wrong in my interpretation of this, but that's the way it looks to me. It's interesting. If it's true, it's interesting. What's it saying about populist voters?
We've got Simon and then Ruth to come in on that point, I think.
I would kind of like, thank you, Barry, for this question. I would kind of like the meteor scholar comes out. So I think about this a lot. And there's a lot of, we have to talk about echo chambers and people getting locked into their own realities. And then you are amplified, you're getting the same opinion that you have amplified back to you and stuff like that. And the trick about social media is, on the one hand, to think about, it's true for all of us. We are on digital media right now, trying to have a differentiated discourse. and succeeding pretty well. And this is the same experience for everyone. So everybody's on Twitter. Who's on Twitter is on Twitter, and it's the same for everyone. And some people are left-leaning, some people are populist, some people are whatever. And kind of like so I wouldn't say like media slants right way per se, or right-wing people use media wrong. That's kind of like, you know, it would be pretty simple and kind of like a techno solution to all of that, which is what we're pursuing at the moment. We're trying to solve the populism problem on a technical level by censorship or by other things. The other thing is that, of course, social media show a particular slice of reality or slice of the public, which is algorithmically generated. And we have been having like 10 years of research on how algorithms gear discourse into certain registers, and how they are, you know, some communities which do not appear in the algorithm at all, you know, and never figure into that, which are maybe healthy, maybe very toxic communities. We don't know, but you know, it doesn't figure. I think that the important thing is that social media amplifies different realities for everyone. And this Andrew Tate, I was part of the Andrew Tate, yeah, bring him down kind of crowd. So, and this was kind of like, we were producing that reality at that moment. It was a wish fulfillment. It was a horrible 2022. And this was a good way to end the year. And we did that together. It's a collective reality and it's a rush, and people do that, and it's fun. And sometimes it leads to people having critical discussions like we have now, or at least to other things. And the right wing and the populists do the same things. The QAnon does the same things. They produce a rush, they produce participation, they produce a game that you can participate in. And for some people, that game leads them to January 6th in the Capitol in Washington. It's the alternate worldview that is the problem. But it's kind of like, I think the problem is the same for everyone. The internet has, you know, boundless resources, which are very good. And the QAnon people use them, you know, they are researchers. They actually use databases and so on and so forth.
So, sorry, I don't know this.
I'm sorry, I don't want to rant. I just think the media dimension is so much more complicated than just like this fuels polarization or populism. I don't think it's true.
But okay, I was going to say, so there's no consequences that are greater for populist supporters than for other segments of the population.
I wouldn't say no.
Ruth Wodak wanted to come in on that point, and I think you also had
I had a question as well, but I would like to add to this point. There's a lot of research about, more from a discourse point of view, what resonates so well in this far right populist, from the world view, how they construct their world and how they upload that and post it and so forth. They're very quote unquote clever about it. And we did a big study looking at sort of the longitudinal development, for example, of the Austrian Freedom Party and how they managed their presence and performance on the internet and on Twitter and Facebook and so forth and so forth. And they were much more interesting for people to read and to look at, now not even thinking about the content, but just what they did. They had rap songs, they had postcards, they had comic books, the leader himself, Strache, sang songs. They had a new Austrian hymn, which they produced. It was full of creativity, where if you juxtapose that and compared that with other political parties, they were boring. Yeah, they just had, you know, politician 1 and politician 2 embracing each other, being interviewed, sending some greetings from somewhere, or telling you that they had eaten a cake in somewhere and were just walking somewhere else, or had met X. And that was a whole different experience, which attracted many young people And they had loads of money, so they had big resources, and they could actually also publish those comic books and distribute them in front of every Viennese school. So they really had a lot of money. And in that way, they really targeted certain groups. But also many people just like to look at that because it was quote unquote interesting. Now, they also had very emotional appeals. And of course, their ideology was then, and that is what Simon talked about, transformed into memes and this and that. And people talked about it. It was funny. It was retweeted. It was insulting. It was all kinds of stuff. But basically, they knew and very early invested enormous amounts of money in their performance on the internet. And they learned a lot about it. They had excellent, obviously, advisors for this. And then came the whole trolls and big algorithms. But they started actually much earlier than those troll machines. So if you want, I can send you some papers about this, because I think it's really interesting, and the other parties took on much later, and they're still very boring, some of them. What I wanted to ask John, actually, because you are doing so much research on political parties and so forth, why actually why the far right parties in rich countries, which, for example, did not suffer so much under the financial crisis 2008, have bigger far-right populist parties than countries where you would expect more polarization, and also resentment and discontent and so forth. And we speculated about that, and I don't know if that makes sense. Is it that in those countries the attraction implies or means that people are afraid to lose what they have, and so the far-right parties appeal to this fear of losing out? They haven't lost out, but they might lose out, and their children might not have it better than they have had it, or all these visions and imaginaries which used to be around. Or are there other explanations? So I would be very interested in what you think about that.
I think certainly the research I've done is looking at the aftermath of the European debt crisis of 2008. And what you seem to get was that in Southern Europe, especially the sort of bailout countries like Spain, Greece, Portugal to a certain extent, the discontent was channeled against austerity, and a lot of the people who were sort of left behind tended to be younger people. And they tended to be, and generally, if you looked at sort of the way issues correlated in people's minds, the issue of the EU, which is a very crucial issue and a sort of flag of the radical populist right, was sort of associated far more with economic issues. So what you seem to get in Southern Europe was a radical populist left, such as Syriza and Podemos in Spain, and only rather later did you get the emergence of a radical populist right, but well after the crisis with the rise of Vox in Spain and Chega.
And Golden Dawn.
Oh, Golden Dawn, yes, but they were quite much. I mean, they were an over.
They were fascist
party.
Yeah.
They were actually, the symbol was like a swastika.
Yeah.
They were even so far that they were almost out of the family. But yes, they did exist, but they were much smaller than Syriza. In Northern Europe, the issue of EU integration came to be correlated far more with cultural issues. So you tended to get Eurosceptic views associated with nationalist and socially conservative views. And I think you may be right. There was a general feeling of insecurity, which was not as obvious as it was in Southern Europe. And therefore, this general unease may have manifested itself in terms of a sort of cultural resistance to globalization and to European integration, rather than, a bread and butter economic dispute, effectively. So there seemed to be a very clear difference between Northern and Southern Europe, I think, in the wake of the European debt crisis, in exactly the way you pointed out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so with apologies for the long wait, we've got a question from Ruth Shaw.
Mute. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I was wondering whether, is there anyone from the business school on this call? Because I was wondering whether there are people with those classic marketing theories knowledge who would be able to comment on the reason why you have a population who are susceptible. Because obviously it must be to do with, I mean, what Ruth Fodak was describing was fantastic marketing expertise in finding the hooks and making something almost like making a community people want to be part of and they feel good, and there's lots of actual positive reinforcement of consuming that material. They become part of a community. So perhaps that's to do with the degree of the number of people who feel marginalized. And I was wondering also if in a rich country that is not because there's greater inequality, but because there is an understanding that inequality could be solved. There is no reason for there to be any poor people. And so there must be some other group who are imposing our marginalization on us, whether for whatever reason we feel left behind. Because I don't know of studies of this, but I'm presuming there must be. There definitely are sort of studies of ecological ideas in geography. And I think that eugenics is a British invention and around the same time as Lebensraum. So those points made by Rico about ecological, being positive towards the environment and a feeling that you have a right to be at one with nature, being a kind of a nationalistic thing as well. It also happened when people settled the Americas and South Africa. It's very much that kind of chosen people, let us be free and be one with the land. And that seems very healthy, and it's very sort of Protestant, but then at the same time it's quite fascist and excluding of other groups. Sorry, they're not really questions, they're sort of comments, because I don't have intelligent questions from this subject. But also something you said about that kind of Rico, about eco-fascists. I noticed the parallel between Ruth's comment about those kind of perfect folk. I couldn't catch the word you were using, Ruth. But that kind of the clean people. I've noticed that with interacting with people in Extinction Rebellion myself, that they are a bit cult-like. So although I would agree with their agenda in terms of getting things on the front page, I don't necessarily want to be with them, because there's something quite sort of narrow about their sort of. And also they're all getting out their Apple iPhone full of minerals mined in Zambia by, so there's a lot of overlap with geography, different areas on sort of historical geography of how people justified their colonialism. And it just would be so interesting if there's a research group taking it forward, looking at populism in that context. Sort of why people feel they need to be freed from some sort of oppression. And nowadays we can't go colonize somewhere so easily. So perhaps we reinvent it in our streets. That's where I was trying to head, really.
Anybody
Sorry.
Want to respond? Set of interesting comments.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I agree with what you're saying in the sense that there is definitely an overlap with geography. I mean, I'm working with some colleagues in geography around this field of populist ecologies, in a broad sense, thinking about not how populist movements or leaders intersect or relate to or affect different elements of the environment or ecological crisis. There's many ways in which you can explore this. So I think there is a lot of overlap. I don't have much to say on sort of the colonial side of this, but one thing that I mean, thinking about XR, right? So there's one relationship I think between ecologism and populism I didn't talk about, which is one that's viewed as kind of progressive, right? So Greta Thunberg, XR is seen as a sort of more progressive way of thinking. You know, they have some sort of use of populist language and discourse in the ways in which they present climate change narratives and the ways in which they try to mobilize people. But at the same time, I think you're right to point to actually there's also some problems with this, not least there are, you know, there's some elements of that which might point to, you know, sort of depopulation as a form of, as one sort of a problem, you know, one way to kind of solve the issue of man-made climate change and dealing with sort of dwindling resources. So there are insidious parts to these progressive narratives around populism and ecologism as well. But I think, yeah, that history, I mean, I think to some extent that's what I'm trying to get at, but probably not very well, which is that I think there is a long lineage of this relationship between populism and ecological crisis, or feelings of detachment or exiles from the land. I mean, this short piece I wrote for Political Geography of the other year starts actually with a poem by John Clare. So John Clare was a British agricultural labourer who was a poet in the 18th century, but he was writing at the same time as the Enclosures Act were taking place, in which, you know, what had been common land starts to be privatized in England. And actually a lot of his poems sort of evoke this sense of exile from nature. Anyway, I'll shut up there. I did have a question for Ruth, but I'll let others respond to Ruth's questions or comments.
Did anyone else want to respond on those points? Ruth, Simon, John? Otherwise, we can, we've got a question from Tina and then one from Rico, and then that'll probably wrap things up. So if you're happy, then let's go to Tina.
Yeah, I'll just keep this short and sweet. I just wanted to make a plug for Ruth Shaw, and Rico might also be interested, for one of our speakers tomorrow, Chris Lizotte. Actually, personally don't know his work, but he's coming from political geography, and I don't know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it might. We don't have anyone from any business school that I know of, but yeah, I just going to highlight that.
I see Summer has a hand up.
Yeah.
The other thing, just on what Rico said, was about there is definitely a very strong and recurrent theme of fascism about brown people having too many children. When they talk about the population crisis, there isn't one, but obviously there is if you and I in Britain and people in America have a lot of children, that would be a problem in terms of the climate. So that's also quite interesting, because I can't easily articulate these things to some of the people in XR, but yeah.
Okay, Summer? Got a question? I think you're muted, Summer.
Am I audible?
You're on now. Go for it.
Okay. Actually, I have a direct question. How can we confront this surging pressure of populism? You see, these populist leaders, when they are running the state, they manipulate the legislature, judiciary, academics, media, and whatnot. So above all, they create their own narratives by playing this victim card and making villain of the minorities. So they create an atmosphere of fear by labeling the academicians or the protesters as Naxals and put them in the prison. So in this condition, how the civil society, they can come forward and they can confront this pressure of populism? This question I wish to ask.
Okay, that sounds like a general question for the panel. So does anybody want to go for it? Take on the solution question?
Well, I might start, and everybody can all participate. I mean, this is a very important question, and we always thought it's quite easy to answer it, because once far-right populists were in power, they couldn't actually govern. Now that's wrong. since we know that Orban and PiS and many other far-right populist parties are able to govern, and there are neo-authoritarian states. So that was quite a wrong assumption many researchers had after having watched some of those far-right populist parties failing once they were in government. Now, I basically believe that the most important issue is that other parties have to have good agenda and have to have alternative narratives with which they can also appeal and attract voters. And basically what should not happen is to try to drive more on the right than the right, yeah, because that doesn't work at all. We know that from the Austrian experience. Once you try to be even more xenophobic, people just vote for the far right. They don't vote for these other parties because they just know their agenda better. So it actually, the only way I believe is to have more participation, to not just have, because there is so much loss of trust in many nation states right now. The gaining of trust is only possible by more participation and by alternative programs and narratives which could appeal and attract voters, and also to get some support by the media. If the media don't support political parties, I think that then it's very, very difficult to attract other alternatives.
Thanks, Ruth. Go, Simon.
Yeah, that is the question, and I think we need to talk about it more. We've been analyzing populism for a long time, and kind of like the problem is somewhat clear. And kind of like, in addition to what Ruth said, I think, but my thesis is it's not just parties and it's not just politicians, but it's a cultural war. And kind of like one way to engage with that is to, well, not participate in the cultural war, but to change the topics. When Steve Bannon said, like part of the media strategy of the right is to flood the zone with bullshit, you have to flood the zone with other things. And the internet is a good venue to do that, to highlight other people, to highlight other communities, other knowledges, and other narratives and other explanations of the world and the problems. And I think that's very vital to do that, because the right is very engaging in the solutions they offer and in the narratives they have, and we need to have others. The other thing I want to stress there's so many things, I think the answers are always local. So all the populisms are different. They have different histories in each country or in each region where they are. And they play with these histories. They play with the local kind of like systems of reference that are there that the people are used to. And all the answers, I think, are not like European legislation of the internet, for example, but very local things. That's why I write in German, for example, to kind of like address like the local context and not so much talk about America has a different set of problems and a different set of answers to it. I think it's very important to think locally. And in Germany, we say anti-fascism is handiwork. So you do a lot of like engaged stuff with your hands. Kind of like material culture in a way, and I think that's always been very important to me. It's a big problem, as Soma said, and is getting bigger and more engulfing. And my strategies are like do local work and uplift other voices that talk different things than the cultural war stuff. Yeah, but yeah, as smart as ignorant as the next person, I guess.
Okay, thanks. I think we've gone over time, but if anybody has any burning desire to say anything, then feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to have to go and, like George Bush, put food on my family. So just to say thank you to everyone. That was a really valuable session, I think, with some really good interactions. So thank you, and hope to see some of you tomorrow, although I'm not sure I'm going to be able to attend too much, but I'm hoping that you have good sessions. Okay, so thank you all.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good time by all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and
Bye.
see you all tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.